Okay. I'll just edit this part out. We won't have to see it. Just between you and me. Okay. So, welcome to the first video of the first content real video. All right, welcome to the first video on the book that we will be covering, kind of the first playlist of my channel. Bit of a preface. So, I'll be doing a little bit of a video series, about 14 videos covering the book A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. This is basically, Lee Strobel was a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, and he kind of set out almost to disprove Christianity. And throughout his investigation as a journalist, he ended up coming to the conclusion that Christianity is the one true religion. This book contains 3 different parts. Part 1 is examining the record, Part 2 is analyzing Jesus, and Part 3 is researching the resurrection, as titled in the book. Each section has about 6 to 4 chapters, and I'll kind of be going over, each video is going to be 1 chapter. And so this is starting with examining the records, and this video is going to be on chapter 1, titled The Eyewitness Evidence. In this chapter, Lee Strobel kind of asks the question, can the biographies of Jesus be trusted? And by biographies, I mean the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So without any further ado, I'll be getting into kind of the content of this chapter. So we start out with eyewitness testimony, and I have, if you see me looking down, I have my notes here. There's quite a bit of information in each chapter, and I do not have the time to really try to memorize all of this, and I want to be as accurate and as honest as possible. So, eyewitness testimony. We start out by kind of comparing eyewitness testimony to criminal cases, and how that is a very reliable source of evidence. And I don't mean like pointing somebody out on a lineup because you saw a robbery occur across the street. You know, we start out here with the comparison between somebody who got shot in the head but survived and saw his brother and his best friend get killed, you know, close range, and this eyewitness testimony being the only eyewitness testimony to serve to put the criminal who did that behind bars. That's the example that he uses. So this is testimony based on somebody who's been close to the perpetrator or to the person, and who's been around them, who's seen them act, who really knows who they are. You know, it's eyewitness testimony between you and your best friend. And so that is the testimony we're looking at. Very, very reliable. And it's just as crucial, he says here, eyewitness testimony is in documenting the historical events as it is in its reliability in criminal cases. And so the first question that we ask here is, do we have the testimony of anyone who personally interacted with Jesus? And so I'll kind of be asking questions as Strobel did in the book, and answering them as the people that he interviewed did. And do these accounts stand up to the scrutiny of skeptics? So before I go any further, Strobel interviews a few people in this book, and the first one is Dr. Craig Blomberg, so that I can prove to you he is a reliable source. He's the author of a book titled, it's a bestseller, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. He's an American New Testament scholar. He is the president of the Evangelical Theological Society, which is a society based up of biblical scholars, educators, and pastors and students. And they're all devoted to the inerrancy of the Bible and of the gospel. And that is the belief that the Bible is without error, you know, without false statements. He has a PhD from the University of Aberdeen, and it specializes in parables of the Gospels of Luke. So all in all, this man is a very, very well-educated scholar, especially when it comes to the historical literature of the New Testament. And he has dedicated really his entire academic career to the historical literacy that is in the New Testament and to proving the accuracy and to studying the accuracy and validity of these documents. And I want to get that out of the way because I believe it's important not just for me, but for you as well, to see that the people that he's interviewing are qualified to give this information. Just being humans, we're not very reliable. We gain credibility through the research and through the study of certain topics, and this man has clearly, for many, many years, studied these Gospels that we'll go into very, very carefully. So he is a very reliable source. We kind of begin with the question, is it really possible to be an intelligent, critically thinking person and still believe that all four Gospels, or Jesus' biographies, were written by the people whose names have been attached to them? That is, did Matthew write Matthew? Did Mark write Mark? Did Luke write Luke? And did John write John? It's important to acknowledge, strictly speaking, the Gospels were anonymous, but there's uniform testimony of the early church that has Matthew or Levi writing Matthew, John Mark, who was a companion to Simon Peter, writing Mark, Luke, who's a historian and companion to Paul, writing Luke. And the first three I'll be referring to these as the synoptics, because it's the first three Gospels disregarding John. It's important to note now that there are no known competitors for the authors of the first three Gospels or the synoptics. So kind of coming next, and we'll get into John later. Right now I'm just focusing on the first three. Is there any motivation to lie about who wrote these? The answer to that is no. Matthew was a tax collector. He was really the most despised disciple in the Jewish community because he was seen as a traitor to his race, and he was a dirty tax collector who was stealing from other Jews who were already persecuted by the Roman Empire. And Mark and Luke were not one of the 12 disciples. So it wouldn't make any logical sense for somebody who's writing these books with the intent to deceive, to choose three authors with a credibility rating who is so much lower than that of somebody like Simon Peter or Thomas or James, all of which who were part of the 12 disciples. And we actually do see this in history with the apocryphal Gospels. And these were fictitious Gospels that were written, and the people who wrote them said that Philip, Peter, Mary, and James were the authors. And these were people who all have much more influence than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and their names carry much more weight than those people. And these were proven to be false. And so, logically speaking, if somebody were to do this, which it did actually happen, they would have put different names down as authoring these Gospels, these biographies. So what about John? There is some question of authorship. Per Dr. Blumberg, there is testimony of a Christian writer named Papias dating back to around 125 AD, and he's referring to John the Apostle and John the Elder, and it's not clear as to whether the apostle or the elder was the author of the gospel. However, the rest of the early church, everybody else, is uniform in their testimony that it was John the Apostle and son of Zebedee who wrote the gospel. And in any event, the Gospel of John is clearly based off of eyewitness testimony of Jesus. So moving back to the synoptics, Strobel questions the specific evidence that we have that validates them as authors. So the oldest and the most significant is again by Papias, the Christian writer in 125 AD, who specifically affirmed that Mark had carefully and accurately recorded Peter's eyewitness testimony. And he went on to write actually that Mark made no mistake and did not include any false statements. Furthermore, the Christian writer Irenaeus in around 180 AD confirmed the writings of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Given this evidence, we can have confidence that the Gospels were written by the disciples Matthew and John, by Mark, Peter's companion, by Luke, the historian, companion to Paul. And we can be sure that the events that they recorded are based off of either direct or indirect eyewitness testimony. So what comes next after kind of getting through the facts that all the Gospels were written by who they said they were, and all the Gospels were written that were based off of direct or indirect eyewitness testimony? Next question that is asked here is, what kind of literary genre do the Gospels represent? So they represent a form of biographical writing that differs much from modern day biographies. Mark, for example, only writes about a 3-year period when Jesus was in his 30s leading up to his crucifixion. And so why are the biographies here, basically, is what he is asking here. Why are the biographies nowadays so much different from the biographies written back in the ancient times? Bloomberg gives 2 examples, one literary and one theological. Looking at the literary reason, it's just this wasn't how biographies were written back then. You know, they did not have an equal emphasis on the beginning, the middle, and the end of somebody's life. As long as they captured the essence as to what was said and to what the purpose that the person had in their life, that was seen as enough. There wasn't any symbol for quotation marks in ancient Greek and Hebrew literature. So there was no emphasis on trying to document exactly what somebody said. You know, there was really the only emphasis that was put on biographies, because writing was harder back then, was what the person was like and the most important aspects of the person's life. History worth reading back then had to have a purpose. It had to have some lesson to be learned. Therefore, a biographer wanted to record the moments that were exemplary and illustrative and could give meaning to that period in history. Moving to theological, as wonderful as Jesus' life was with all the teaching and miracles that he had, it would be worthless if the events were not historically factual. Especially that Jesus died and rose from the dead. If that part was not historically accurate, then the whole religion will fall apart. And Mark devotes half of his narrative to the events leading up to and including 1 week's period of time culminating in Jesus' death and resurrection. So given the significance of that event, it makes perfectly logical sense in ancient literature for somebody to put such a heavy emphasis on that period of time that he was living, especially leading up to the crucifixion. In addition to the 4 Gospels, scholars refer to what they call as Q. And Q stands for the German word Quell, which means source. It is assumed that Matthew and Luke incorporated some material from this Q into their biographies. And so we have to kind of define what Q is. And Q is referred to many times through biblical scholars. It's just kind of the term they use for this this collection of sources. So what is Q? According to Blomberg, it's a hypothesis. With a few exceptions, it is sayings and teachings of Jesus, which may have formed an entirely separate document, but are now been included as part of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, or Mark and Luke, I should say. We believe Q to be a collection of sayings. It does not have a definitive narrative of what Jesus was like, although if you were to try to put a narrative on it, the claims that he makes with these sayings and in writings seen in Q is he was wisdom personified, and he was by whom God will judge the world and judge humanity. So if you isolate all the sayings in Q, you get the same picture of Jesus that the synoptics describe. Turning our attention to John, the first 3 Gospels are all kind of viewed at the same time. They all have a similar outline of Jesus' life. Because there's differences between the synoptics and the Gospel of John, are there irreconcilable contradictions between them? There seems to be a different linguistic style in John compared to the synoptics, as well as a higher Christology. So more direct claims that Jesus is God, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the resurrection and the life of Jesus. To answer this question, John has different stories of Jesus, but these stories do not contradict the ones in the synoptics. And all four Gospels become very much parallel in their documentation of Jesus when you get to that week prior to the crucifixion of Jesus. The most prominent assumption as to why John differs from the synoptics is that he was largely independent of them. He was one of the core disciples, with Peter, the one who Mark got eyewitness testimony from. He was one of the core disciples, very, very close to Jesus. And so you're going to have different stories, and you're going to have a slightly different viewpoint of kind of who Jesus is. Although every distinctive claim John makes in the gospel, you can find a parallel in the synoptics. To go further, John made very explicit claims that Jesus was God. So you have to ask the question, how do you justify this and not have it chalked up to embellishments, as the Gospel of John was written much later than the first three? To answer this, you find the same theme more implicitly in the synoptics. Specifically, if you look into Matthew 14:22 through 33 and Mark 6 through 45. And this part, in my opinion, is very interesting. The Greek wording in these two literally says, "Fear not, I am," which is the same wording that John used in John 8:58. This is also the same way that God revealed himself in the Old Testament and in the Torah to Moses, you see in Exodus 3:14. And so, kind of going through, looking at this through a historical perspective, you see this is the exact way that God says who he is. And the most common example to find the kind of the parallels between John and the synoptics is the title that Jesus is given in the synoptics, which is Son of Man. There's been an argument that was introduced in a book called A History of God that states that the term Son of Man stressed the weakness of the human condition, and so Jesus was kind of stating that to emphasize his humanity. But however, this is contradicted, as this title Son of Man is a direct allusion to Daniel 17:13 through 14. And I quote, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So Jesus applies the term Son of Man to himself. He is giving himself the title of someone who approaches God himself in his heavenly presence, in his throne room, and is given universal authority and dominion. So the title Son of Man is a title of great exaltation and not really mere humanity, which ties back to the I am in John. Next topic is the Gospel's theological agenda. This is the last sort of topic I'm going to get into in this video as the chapter starts to conclude, and it's going to take a little bit longer to explain because you don't get the explanation until you get all of the facts here. So the argument starts with the question, because John was able to mull over theological issues much longer. So the argument starts out with the question, because John was able to mull over theological issues for a longer period of time, does this fact mean that the Gospel John takes a more theological approach and thus cause the historical material embedded in his biography to be more tainted by the bias and become less reliable? In answering this question, it is not that John is more theological than the synoptics. It is that the gospel has a different cluster of theological emphases. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have distinct theological angles that they highlight, and John just has different angle that he looks at through this theological lens. This creates a new question. Do the theological motivations of all four Gospels cast doubts on their reliability to accurately report what happened? So with any ideological document, this has to be considered, because this has happened in the past. Authors will distort history to save their ideological point. But to conclude that happens with every historical ideological document is simply false. Blomberg states that in the ancient world, the idea of writing a dispassionate, objective history merely to chronicle events with no ideological purpose was simply unheard of. It just didn't happen. So if we use this logic, it would make every single ancient historical document suspect. And the only way that we are able to validate the existence of somebody and the existence of events are the documentation and through these historical documents and through the cross references of people documenting the same event. So if we use this logic, we're not able to prove anything in history actually happened. Although we can create a reasonably accurate history from multiple ancient sources. And we can do the same thing with the Gospels, even if they are ideological. You know, just about every single document, and this is kind of going over the same point again, because I feel like it is very important to look at. And I think this is really the most important point in this first chapter, is that if we look at any sort of historical document, you know, as he says, the idea to write something purely to chronicle the event was unheard of back then. Every single ancient document back then that recorded a moment in history was looked at and was written through some sort of ideological lens. And so we have to apply the same logic and reasoning when you look at and document certain historical events in other ancient documents as we do with the Gospels, even if they are quote-unquote ideological. So this concludes this chapter and this video. You know, I really do hope that you're able to get something through from this. I hope that this could mean something to you. If you have any questions, I'm going to put my email in the description of this video. Feel free to reach out and email me. For those who know me, it is a different email, but if you have my number, feel free to text me and ask me questions. And if you have questions about the book, or if you want to sort of validate what I said and quote-unquote fact check me, the book is A Case for Christ. I'll be going over the next few chapters in the next few weeks. Right now, we're on track to get another video out in a week, but I am a college student. I'm in university. Things will get busy at some point, so there may be a week or two where I'm not able to get a video out. I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. Don't forget, you know, if you like this video, do leave a like, because it does increase the amount of times just it's shown to people. You know, it helps the algorithm show it to people, and I do want to get this to as many people as possible. If you see me around on campus, say hi. I go to the University of Tennessee. I love to see people. If you've seen my video, if you've liked it, if you have questions, you know, come up and ask me, and I'm going to do my best to answer you. But yeah, this is it. So I'll see you in the next video, hopefully. Bye.